Hi, I'm JonnyLockjaw. If we're being honest, it's really fun to watch people burn, especially heretics, especially in Darktide. That's why today I'm going to show you how to make a Flamethrower Psyker. Now just remember, this is to help you. And if you don't like what I like, I don't give a fuck. Alright, so let's start off with the loadout for weapons first. Realistically, for the melee weapon, you're going to want a force sword. Otherwise, you're just going to want a force sword because they're the best Psyker weapons. Or at least, should I say, they're the best Psyker melee weapons, typically. The main weapon that it is that you're going to be rocking on this specific build is going to be the Pergatus Force Staff, if you could have guessed based off of the fact that this is a flamethrower build. This is effectively going to be where it is that your horde clear is going to be coming from. So you're just going to want a Pergatus Force Staff. Anything that can generate Soul Blaze, it is going to be really good. It's going to be what you want. Anything that increases the amount of damage over time that you can do to enemies specifically is going to be really good. These curios are going to be really similar to from my last build video, the Sail Psyker. So go back into that if you haven't already done that to sort of figure out why these are specifically important. You want to increase toughness, you're a Psyker. Increased toughness is really good. You want to increase toughness regeneration speed because the amount of toughness that you will want is going to always be at max. So the amount of toughness regeneration that you can have is always good. So yeah, so a lot of these, again, I've already covered in my last video, so go ahead and run that one to get to a little more in-depth sometimes if you have other questions. But just to sort of start off, we're going to go Soul Stealer. It replenishes 7.5% toughness on warp attack kills. It's typically anything that you're going to be doing with this. It's going to be basically most of the things you're doing here. And again, that generates Soul Blaze, which is a warp attack. You just want increased toughness. It's really good to have. So on this one, we're going to go Soul Stealer. It's going to increase the amount of toughness on warp attack kills. That one's super... It's spectacular. We're going to go Quietude because it's going to replenish 5% toughness for each 10%. It's a self-explanatory. When you're not attacking with your peril-generating attacks and abilities, you're going to be quelling. So, you know, keep that in mind. Again, toughness regeneration, always good. We're going to go into Perilous Combustion. Killing an elite or specialist enemy applies 3 stacks of Soul Blaze to nearby enemies, causing damage over time. Setting a blaze to everything effectively so that you can actually get things killed. You're effectively there to damage everything, but because you're going to be damaging everything in such a wide area, you're not going to be able to focus down any ones. You may have blown yourself up if that 10% chance didn't at least proc to quell 10% of your peril, and then obviously replenishes 5% of your toughness. Because the flamethrower is more specifically geared towards taking out large groups of enemies, but it's not super great at taking out elites, this is where Brain Rupture is going to come in. So Brain Rupture is going to be what it is it obviously used to take out the elites. Low-level Psykers will do their best to try to Brain Rupture Poxwalkers individually, in the middle of hordes, no less, and most of the time they'll get like 75% of the way through Brain Rupture and then somebody will kill it, and all of that time is effectively mitigated. Don't do that. Never Brain Rupture a single enemy unless it's off to the side and you don't want to go attack it with the flamethrower or run up and hit it with a melee weapon. Please. Please. I'm begging. I'm begging. If nothing else, if you see this video and all it is that you take from it is that you shouldn't Brain Rupture one single enemy in the middle of a horde, that's... I've done my job. I've done my job, and every other person that you play with, if you ever play as a Psyker, is going to love you more exponentially for it. So yeah, keep that in mind. Specifically, it's really good against those enemies, but that's just because the Psyker typically doesn't have anything that goes against those really well. At the higher level difficulties, you can effectively ogre enemies. You can take out the Carapace armored and flak armored enemies. You can take out the ogre enemies in 2 or 3, depending on the variant. I think Reapers you can get in maybe 2, depending on some variables. Typically the Crushers take 3. They're more heavily armored, they have more health. But it depends. Again, there's a lot of variables that go into it. There's a bunch of different things that can happen in procs that can happen sort of like on the back end that you can't really control sometimes. And then you're just going to basically get both of these buffs. You're going to get Kinetic Resonance because using your combat ability makes your Brain Rupture charge 75% faster and generate 50% less peril for 10 seconds. This one's super good for a lot of different reasons, but just using your ability and then, you know, suddenly, guess what? You get to Brain Rupture the boss enemy a bunch of times in a row really quickly. Believe it or not, there's very beneficial because it allows you to charge it faster, and because it generates 50% less peril. You can effectively dump like 5 or 6 of this build's strongest attacks onto a boss enemy and effectively 50% it. It's, you know, And then down here, we're going to go Kinetic Flare. All attacks have 10% chance on hit to brain rupture the target. It's really good for a lot of different reasons to just have this sort of happening every 15 seconds, because there's a lot of different things that proc this that you wouldn't really expect unless you have it. So keep in mind that while this doesn't seem super good, and the 15-second cooldown is kind of a lot, it's going to come in handy more often than it doesn't, because every 15 seconds you effectively will have it pop off if you're constantly fighting. Not necessarily that you will be constantly fighting unless you're doing high-intensity heretic missions and stuff, but like, keep in mind, this is going to be popping off more often than it won't. 10% chance on literally every attack that you hit, especially when you're bursting down a horde with the flamethrower, is significant. And it can get rid of, again, the carapace armored and flak armored enemies, which is sort of what it's there for. Just a stepstone, we're going to get minus 5% peril generation. We're going to go wildfire here. When an enemy dies while affected by your soul blaze, nearby enemies each gain up to 4 stacks of soul blaze. They cannot gain more stacks than a dying enemy had. This is just going to generate more damage over time to a lot more enemies. Your soul blaze is going to pop off to a bunch of different enemies a lot faster. Obviously, it's super funny to watch soul blaze sort of spread out after they die, and it does happen pretty significantly. So just keep in mind that that's what that's there for, is just increased damage over time, which is what this build is meant for. Especially, say, you kill an elite or specialist enemy in the middle of a horde, and it applies 3 stacks of soul blaze, and then those enemies die of soul blaze, and then those enemies die, and then those enemies die, and then, you know, it just spreads. Like a wildfire, even. Ha! And then down after that, we're going to go Psykinetics Aura, decreasing ability cooldown for you and your allies and coherency by 5% on elite or specialist kills. Again, that's just really good. Everybody's abilities are good. Reducing cooldowns on everybody's abilities makes you the best teammate to have in the world. And then we're going to go here. It's just that we have to go here. 10% toughness replenishment for you and your allies and coherency. Believe it or not, significant, especially when all 4 of you are next to each other. That's just 40% increased toughness replenishment for everyone. Then we're going to go one with the warp, gain toughness damage reduction of 10% to 33% based on your current peril. And then here we're going to go minus 5% peril generation. That leads us to our capstone, which is going to end up being Venting Shriek. That's going to trigger our brain rupture secondary abilities a little bit faster. But we'll get into that. We'll get into that relationship in a moment. Venting Shriek now decreases peril generation by 1% for each enemy hit, stacking 25 times. So yeah, you can effectively have this at all moments of time. So if you fire this into a crowd of poxwalkers, or just a crowd of enemies in general, with the flamethrower, again, consider that every time that hits them and damages them, it's an attack, it hits. It's going to generate a stack of this that lasts 5 seconds, which effectively means that you'll be able to throw out more of these fires. You'll be able to throw out more fire in succession without having to quell peril, which is going to be what it is that damage source is going to be sustainable. And then this one, consider this one is really good. It's the ability modifier. This is also going to stack with Soul Blaze and Wildfire and anything else that generates Soul Blaze. Anytime that you use Venting Shriek, it applies 1 to 6 stacks of Soul Blaze to a target based on your current peril. So, you know, obviously when you have max peril and you use this, you're going to get 6 stacks. It's of Soul Blaze, which is really good. And then consider the fact that it goes in like a wide circle and then also mostly in front of you. So most of those enemies are going to be on fire. So you can set an entire horde on fire with Soul Blaze and fire your flamethrower into it and then increase damage. And then again, anytime that somebody dies because of Soul Blaze or with Soul Blaze, those nearby enemies gain more stacks of Soul Blaze, etc., 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 etc. You know, it just sort of goes onto all that. And then consider, at the base cooldown, it has a 30-second cooldown. It's the shortest Psyker ability cooldown. You're going to be able to fairly frequently use that and then switch to Brain Rupture and then very quickly pop a bunch of heads. Super good, again, against boss enemies in particular. What I like to do specifically with that is generate as much peril as possible with the Flamethrower. And then once you hit them with a bunch of Soul Blaze because you Venting Shriek and then they get a bunch of Soul Blaze stacks, then you Brain Rupture them a bunch of times, and then it sort of just repeats the process significantly over and over again. Really good for taking out bosses. You're going to get, you know, this is just the next stepping stone. You're going to get 5% peril mitigation. Right here, you're going to go 10% health boost, and then here you're going to go Warp Rider, so up to 20% damage from all sources based on your current peril. This one's really good just in general. I've basically gone through this tree again, so in more detail, watch the last build video. At least I assume it's an increased coherency radius. Super good for, again, this specific thing. But in general, coherency on Psykers is really important because you want toughness and you need toughness. Speaking of toughness, we got plus 5% toughness damage reduction, increased quell speed, pretty self-explanatory on that. Plus 15 toughness, pretty self-explanatory. You need all these. And that leads us to Warp Siphon. Killing elites and specialist enemies gains you a warp charge. Your next combat ability spends all available warp charges to reduce the cooldown of that combat ability by 7.5% per warp charge. And then again, down here, we're going to go with 6 instead of 4. So realistically, this 30-second cooldown can go pretty quickly. So you can toss out Venting Shriek and then get it pretty quickly back. You can have up to 45% reduced cooldown on 30 seconds. Using Warp Siphon with max stacks, you can effectively have a 16.5 second cooldown on Venting Shriek. Max stacks being 6 stacks because I'm running this one. You can use this and then use this and then 16.5 seconds later use this again, and then this whole cycle repeats itself. That is, of course, if you're considering actually killing all of these and you get the stacks to do it. But it can pretty effectively snowball if there's enough elites and specialists around for you to take out. And then again, especially if like you do it and you do this Venting Shriek cooldown, but then you're using that time to Brain Rupture. And then guess what? After you Brain Rupture a bunch of times, you're 16.5 seconds in, you use Venting Shriek again, and then the cycle repeats itself. You can see where this kind of leads down into a rabbit hole of brain pops. But after that, you're going to go 6% peril generation reduction for each warp charge. This one's just really good, again, especially for the Flamethrower specifically, allowing you to maintain as much damage as possible while throwing out the most amount of fire as you can is the best possible option. And then this is going to go into Empyrean Empowerment. Increases all base damage by 4% for each warp charge. Again, very significant, very important, super useful. In this tree, this is where it differs from the last build. We're going to go in Fire Reborn here, actually. So killing an enemy with Soul Blaze has a 10% chance to grant you a warp charge. And then, believe it or not, the reason we're doing that is because of all these secondary passive abilities for Soul Blaze. You know, it's pretty good, especially when a lot of your kills inevitably are going to be from Soul Blaze because enemies Soul Blaze on them. Even if you can last hit a bunch of enemies very quickly, and then all of those enemies give you a 10% chance to gain a warp charge, and then that just sort of feeds into the cycle of Brain Ruptures, and then that feeds into the cycle of killing elites and specialists, give Soul Blaze, and then head popping elites and specialists, generate Soul Blaze on the enemies, and then those enemies catch fire and then kill other enemies with Soul Blaze. But anytime you kill elites and specialists, you gain warp charges. But anytime, you know, it's again, it's a cycle. It's just feeding the warp elites and specialists so that you can continuously brain pop and rupture and kill people with Soul Blaze while also taking out huge hordes because that's what this thing is good at. So yeah, quick scroll down just so you can sort of see where the tree is. We've talked about it all. And here we are. Gonna do that. I'm gonna do it a little slower this go around. And there we go. So there's the Flamethrower Psyker. I mean, I think it's pretty self-explanatory. This one's really good, specifically again for Horde Clear. It's really good against elites and specialists, especially if you can get the cycle of Soul Blaze siphoning kills and you can get a bunch of different elites. You can take down bosses very fast with this as well. Super good. At least I think it's good. And then again, refer to beginning of video, etc. In any case, thank you for watching. If you like this, please go ahead and like the video. If you want to comment on any given point that I made, go ahead and comment. I would genuinely appreciate it. Please consider subscribing for more. Again, I would genuinely appreciate that. But for now, again, my name is JonnyLockjaw. I love you guys. Don't die. I'll see you in the next one.